Thank you very much for that great introduction. I think for me, it's always important in forums like this to always remember how young our democracy really is. I think we're all very critical at times, but we also really have to remember that in terms of the democracies in the world, we're still very immature, and I think we still make very immature mistakes as we grow. So for me, it's always been remembering the fact that without democracy, it's still at the very tender age. If it was a person, it'd actually still be under the legal drinking age in the US. So for me, I always remember that and say that as we grow, we mature. I think there's many things that we need to work on. But also with my growing up, there were very important principles that I kind of always followed, also applied to me. Firstly, being an African, I've always believed that it's never really been the responsibility of just the parents to raise a child. It's always been a responsibility of the community. I think most of us here can probably relate to that in some way or another. Specifically, if you grew up like I did, or some of the people in a township or a small village where you knew that if you got in trouble, your parents weren't there, you were sure that your neighbors, just as quickly as your own parents, give you a quick smack. And you knew that when your parents got home, they'd do the same thing again. But this time, it was for getting caught, inconveniencing the neighbors, and actually being in trouble. So these are principles for me that I've always gone through. So it's always been the collective responsibility elements that I've always gone through. But today, taking that principle in mind, my talk to you today is really about two simple things: choices and consequences. So I'm up here today to tell you a brief story about a bit of my professional life, but mostly it's about the choices I've made and the consequences that followed, and why I've actually been honored with the opportunity to actually speak on the stage. Like most good stories of mine, this starts in a bar. A very specific bar at UCT where I studied. But as you walk into the bar, there was a very clear sign in front of you. The first couple of times I walked in there, the sign didn't actually really, I saw it once or twice, I read it, I walked past it. But over the years of frequenting that place, frequent as once or twice a month, like any good student. So I would walk past, I'd read that sign, I got very, very familiar with it. And over the last 15 years, I've actually found myself repeating that phrase over and over and over again. Okay. Slides, no, maybe. Okay, I'll just carry on. But the sign at the bar actually really said, the life we live is a consequence of the choices we make. You know, I really only repeated that sign to myself, that phrase to myself, in moments where I'm trying to reaffirm the decisions I've made and making sure that I'm trying to live my life on purpose, or trying to convince myself all my decisions are actually deliberate. But I've also learned throughout life that most of us actually make decisions on a very subconscious or superficial level. And every now and again, we are faced with choices that are involved, emotional, and often shake and often challenge our core beliefs as human beings. This story is actually basically one of those. It starts about 4.5 years ago. I decided to leave a fairly good, stable job in the private sector. And I joined a very well-meaning state-owned entity. Well-meaning in the sense of the organization's mission, vision, and mandate really resonated with me as a person. It was a small organization that was designed to provide funding towards entrepreneurs and for not-for-profit companies that wanted to build affordable housing for middle, low income. Middle, low income in this sense is defined, people earning below about 8,000 Rand a month. So with my background being in many things, medicine, finance, property is one of the big things that I actually really concentrated on. So my professional career had largely been in property development, property investment. So I decided at that very moment that I would join, now it works. So at that very moment, I decided that I would join public sector. I would actually apply my skills, my knowledge, my training into public sector. Mostly because of the fact that I thought that my skills were probably better utilized in that area versus in the private sector. And for once, I thought that I would follow my heart instead of my head. Being financially minded, and being raised by an accountant, that was something that was very foreign to me. It was almost like that fight between, what the heart wants, what the mind thinks is right. But eventually I decided, follow my heart, follow that stream. Primarily because of the fact that I've always believed that more professionals need to join the public sector. Not because you need experience, but I think currently in our country, the public sector would utilize your skills very well. So instead of sitting in private sector looking at financial hurdles, profitability, and etc., I thought that I would move from that and stop complaining about government, but actually join government and see what assistance I could provide based on my background and my skills. For the first 2.5 years of joining the entity, it was amazing. The atmosphere in the organization was great. We were building amazing projects, jobbing in a city in Newtown. Some of you guys might be familiar with the Mubbling precinct, but projects around that area. And whenever someone would ask me about what do I do, where do I work, I'd have that warm, fuzzy feeling in your pit of my stomach as I actually explained it. It was really from a point of pride and really believing that I was working somewhere that I was actually providing greater good versus shoulder profits. So this went on for literally the first 2.5 years of organization, me being there. But probably about 12, 18 months ago, almost at the peak or the height of our performance and everything else, I started noticing very strange things would happen. As the organization is a state entity, we had a very clear and defined process of how we get funds in the organization from National Treasury and how we pay them out. But all of a sudden, we started getting ad hoc deposits from not too sure where, but they would come to the organization. A number of projects came in that we weren't entirely sure where they came from. But every time that anyone in senior management would ask our executive where the money came from, where the project came from, we would get a very politically evasive response. The response we get was almost pre-recorded on autoplay, and the response was something in line of, these projects have been approved at a higher political level. This is really not your place to ask. Your job here is to really follow political directive, tracking the money, where it came from, where it went. And over a period of time, we realized that our well-meaning state-owned entity had paid out close to about 4 nganja's worth of money to separate projects. So you can do the maths, you can look at the media. So what happened after that to me was almost kind of, my world had been shaken. People that I'd worked with and trusted over a period of time had started doing things that I would say were uncharacteristic. So at that very moment, I was left with a couple of choices. Because as a detective, you may find something. But what I didn't actually ask myself very early on is, once I'd found it, what would I actually do with it? And I think that was one of the hardest questions. But at that very moment, I saw that I only had 3 choices. The first one was literally run like hell, get out of there, find a new job, forget about it. The second option that I thought of was pick up the carpet and sweep it underneath, close it, and pretend like nothing happened. The third option was infinitely harder. It was that choice I had to make of who would I tell and would I do anything about it. At that point in time, I decided that I needed to step forward and actually explain this to 1, our internal auditors, external auditors, and 3, National Treasury. Because ultimately what I've always believed is that in this country, if there's anyone who understands government policy, funding, it's National Treasury. So based on that tip-off and a couple of months later, the investigation that ensued has actually become something bit of a folklore story within government departments, as in, based on the information we gave out to the National Treasury, 4 court cases have actually been implemented, close to 500 million worth of assets from different developers, different people who have actually been seized from the asset forfeiture unit within National Department. And something else is that If you had seen the business report about 2 weeks ago, you would have seen that a certain minister had actually put one of their ministry's entities under administration. So for me, it was always one of those things that if you found out what happened, if you told someone, would something actually be done? So out of this whole experience, what I learned was that with instances like this where government, people, institutions actually defrauded, it's not the government that actually gets defrauded. It's actually the people where the program and the funds were intended to benefit. So throughout my journey, I wanted to make sure that one, I had a couple of personal goals I wanted to achieve. One was making a difference. And by actually being the person that stepped forward, I actually wanted to say that to other people in national departments that one, there's a template to follow, and two, there are people that take it seriously. And the other thing about it is that when we look at elements around service delivery protest, for me, it's always very important to understand that whenever government programs are funded, it's almost like putting money or pouring water through a very small pipe. You put in 5 liters of water in, you expect 5 liters to come out at the end. When only 10% of the water comes out, it's always a case of leakage. But ultimately, it's always one of those things that you need to understand that the people that are being impacted on, deprived, are the same people that you voted for. So for me, there's all of those driving principles that actually made me do what I did. But going through this whole journey, I think I went through the full spectrum of emotions. Happiness, satisfaction, fear, and a lot of the time, paralyzing fear. Because during this whole process, I would meet with National Treasury, we would discuss what had happened, and for a short period of time, a lot of the people that I'd snitched on were actually still working in the organization. So basically what that meant was that half the organization were in support of what had happened, the other half, or less than half, was still kind of really protecting themselves. So that was something that I still was in the organization and we had to face and live with. The other part of that was that during the investigation, one of the officers from the asset forfeiture unit basically sat me down and said they would suggest that I would either one, go on paid holiday for about 3 months, or two, go under witness protection. That's when I think the real fear kind of kicked in that this was real and my life, or other people's lives, were actually maybe in danger. But the only way that I actually overcame that fear and actually managed to cope over the last 12 months was really through the support that I got from people in the organization, colleagues, friends, and ultimately, but ironically, during the same time, my father was actually proofreading the final chapters of his autobiography, aptly named A Life of Purpose. So, which actually traces his life, his professional life, his education, his struggle, Robben Island, and a couple of other things, but ultimately looks at his years in public service and the hurdles that he overcame. So for me, it was always a case of, at least I had the anecdotes, the stories, and someone I could lean on. Same thing as with my partner, family. They didn't really play, they played a lot of support, but mostly they played a role of distraction. The last thing you want is when you get home, just talk about what you did at work. So at least when you got home, I knew that someone was there, smile, and could take my mind off work. But ultimately, my message here today is that in the process of raising our democracy as the community that lives in it, it's ultimately our responsibility to do it. I made a choice, and I'm currently living with the consequences of that choice. And I believe that if we all make similar choices, or we all make a stand, collectively we can make a difference to our democracy and ensuring that there's accountability, there's responsibility, and ultimately we serve the people that remain to serve as a country. This has been a very short summary of my story. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share it with you. Thanks.